Nightcrawler just got previewed by Fantasy Flight Games, and he comes with a new protection precon with new protection cards you can put in any player deck, as well as a new basic card. There'll probably be a bit more than that, but that's what's been revealed for now. And we're going to talk about that here because I think one of these could lead to a brand new archetype in protection, and I particularly like the allies as well, so we'll talk about those at the end. So we've got two new cards that kind of work together. So up first, we've got Change of Fortune. This is a 1-cost upgrade, max 1 per player, but you can play it under any player's control. That's kind of interesting, but for the most part, you'll probably be playing this under your own control and have some kind of plan around it, because what this says is response. After you defeat an enemy during the villain phase, exhaust this card, draw 2 cards. Now, this is really interesting. I mean, draw 2 cards is fantastic, but defeating the enemy during the villain phase is quite a big ask, especially for some heroes and some decks. So you're kind of going to have to go out of your way to achieve this. And then we've got Under Control, which is another upgrade, but it's 0 cost. And this one you actually attach to a minion. The response here is after a hero defends against attached minion's attack and takes no damage, deal 4 damage to an attached minion. Now, I'm slightly confused as to why it cares if the attack deals damage or not, because I feel going out of your way to defend a minion's attack is actually quite, quite a big ask already, because it's not something you typically want to do most of the time. But because of that kind of inconvenience, I think that's the reason this is a 0 cost card, which deals 4 damage, because in other circumstances, that's a fantastic ratio. Now, Change of Fortune being a 1-cost upgrade that can draw you 2 cards potentially every turn, also potentially fantastic with, emphasis on the potential here. So let's look a little bit more closely at these, starting with Under Control, which is the first card previewed in the article. Now, this card it has a lot of hoops that it wants you to jump through, a lot of conditions that have to be met. So this is attached to a minion. So you ideally want to draw a minion in the round before your new turn has started. So that's already kind of an infrequent event. It's not, uncommon, but it's not necessarily common either. It will depend on the scenario and a bit of luck. You can easily go 2, 3, 4, turns in a row without seeing a minion in some scenarios, in solo play at least. So definitely already shouting out multiplayer to me. But let's say you get lucky enough and you have a minion in play, or maybe you've left one in play from previous round, but that means you've had to, deal with its damage somehow, so it is what it is. But let's say you've got that minion, and now what do? Well, you have to have this card in hand at that moment. Yes, it's an upgrade, but since it's attached to a minion, you need to make sure that minion is there and the card is in your hand. So yeah, if you've got 3 copies of this in your deck, it's not going to be uncommon to have it in your hand, but you can't necessarily guarantee it either. So we've got 2 semi-uncommon kind of events that have to collide together to make this work, unless you're just leaving those minions around turn after turn, which not a great strategy overall. Then you have to leave the minion alive until the villain phase, so it will attack you, so you can defend it, so you can trigger Under Control. And sometimes this will be absolutely fine. Other times, maybe that minion has the patrol keyword or something else problematic that's going to cause you problems and be just a pain for the hero turn you just took. So that's kind of annoying. Then you have to defend it. And defending a minion attack is, it's doable. But how are you dealing with the villain's attack? Are you maybe blocking with an ally or something? Do you have a form of readying? But just exhausting to defend a minion's attack, when maybe you could have just defeated that minion or something, it doesn't feel great. So unless there's something new in the kind of, Nightcrawler's precon that we haven't seen yet, I'm a little bit skeptical about doing this. But if you do manage to bring all these things together, you will get 4 damage having only spent a 0-cost card. But was it worth to defend in the first place? How did you get these things come about together? How many turns are you going to have Under Control in hand and not have a minion on the board in solo play? Or how many turns are you going to have a minion on the board and just not happen to have this in your hand? So it's asking quite a lot, and I'm not particularly convinced about this. Now, Change of Fortune, which we're going to look at now, makes this a lot more enticing, because despite all these hoops and hurdles, 2 cards drawn is fantastic. But I'm not too convinced Under Control is going to make a lot of, somewhat optimized, carefully built Change of Fortune decks. Though I would, I'd like to be surprised. I haven't tested these cards. Disclaimer, this is just me talking about what's been previewed, about how I think it will go. But Change of Fortune, I think, looks really fun. And yeah, getting 2 cards is really good. But kind of like I said for the previous card, you're going to need that minion to come into play, and you're going to need to find a way to deal with it in either this hand or maybe the next hand, depending on if you've got, an event for the villain phase or an upgrade that's going to trigger during the villain phase. So you have to have these things lined up still, and that's quite a big commitment. That's quite a big ask for things to work out. But like I say, like I've kept saying, 2 cards is really good. So how are you going to use that card? Who is going to use this card? Well, I'm thinking about existing decks, and I don't particularly think it fits very well. Perfect defense decks tend to be very tight on deck space, and if you look at the previous card, under control, what kind of perfect defense deck has extra readies and things to use on minions? When you probably might even have encounter cards be coming in for other players and things, you don't know what's happening. Who's going to commit to doing that? I don't think that's very common, and like I say, deck space is tight. Same for readying decks. If you're, a hero who has good stats, and you're trying to ready up constantly to use them, when are you going to defeat a minion in the villain phase? Not very often, I would say. So I think for the most part, this leaves us with Change of Fortune kind of creating a brand new archetype. Yes, we've got various cards previously which let us defeat minions in the villain phase, but we've never been incentivized to do so. It's kind of been more of a case of, oh, this works out, I guess I will defeat this minion here with this way that I have to do it. But nobody's building decks to defeat minions in the villain phase generally. Retaliate decks can be quite fun, and I think that's a small exception, and I think Change of Fortune will do well there. So on the one hand, I think there will be decks, and specifically certain heroes, who can naturally defeat enemies in the villain turn a little bit, where you might just build a normal deck for them and just throw one copy of Change of Fortune in. But otherwise, and a lot of the time, I think you're going to have to go out of your way, which is where I think that archetype comes in. And what do I call this new archetype? Well, I'm calling it Slay Delay. So Minion Slayer is a common kind of role in Marvel Champions, not really an archetype, but you slay minions. So what happens if you're building a deck around slaying minions in the villain phase? Well, you're kind of delaying the slaying, if you will, pardon the rhyme. So that's kind of where that comes from. If there's a better term, let me know. But I think it describes how this works pretty well. You're going to be kind of ignoring minions briefly and then dealing with them later. And to do that, we need to build in other cards that work with Change of Fortune. We need to build in cards that let you defeat minions in the villain phase, and we need to build in cards that let you keep the minions around. So how can we defeat minions? Well, one of the first ways I thought about was with allies, with something like Spider UK, who, when he defends, he gets to deal damage. But the wording on Change of Fortune says you have to defeat the minion, not an ally. So it's going to have to be your hero or an upgrade or an event, because those are kind of extensions of your hero. So no real ally help. They can soften them up or, tank the damage for a bit. But if you defeat them with an ally, then you're not getting that card draw from Change of Fortune. Powerful Punch and First Hit are 2 protection events which can deal damage when the minion attacks. So those are pretty good, but they're generally kind of inefficient cards in the first place. So now you're having to use inefficient cards for a slightly unreliable game plan to try and draw 2 cards. Is it worth it? I'm not quite convinced here on its own merits. Counterpunch, Sidestep, these are ways to deal damage, when defending. Sidestep actually makes you defend, gives you, 3 damage blocked, but it only deals 1 damage. Counterpunch can deal a lot more damage potentially, but it's kind of somewhat niche. It's not something that every hero is going to be able to use well and, want to spend their defense in the first place to trigger Counterpunch. Long story short here, none of these events in protection I think are perfect. All of them are slightly inconvenient or inefficient or low damage. You're going to have to combine something else to really manage to defeat these minions. So imperfect solutions to try and trigger Change of Fortune. We also have ways to kind of deal damage more passively or every so often with a lot of the upgrades we have. So we have Energy Barrier, Electrostatic Armor, Dauntless, Flow Like Water. Some of these will, when you defend or are attacked, will get to ping a little bit of damage back. And generally, it's okay, but Dauntless, you need to stay healthy, and if you're kind of letting minions come through and attack, it gets a little bit dicey on that front. Electrostatic Armor requires you to defend. Again, defending a minion attack is not really something that is efficient. It's just not great. Flow Like Water means you have to play a defense event against that minion, and who's, paying out costs for defense events against minions? It's just not a great game plan in general. Energy Barrier is a fantastic card, but using it for minion damage, again, maybe not ideal, at least if it's avoidable. Quick strike minions, okay, Energy Barrier is great against because that attack is hitting you no matter what. But do I really want to leave a minion around to get an extra attack off? It's just tricky, guys. Warpath is interesting as an ally that has a hero response that lets you take an action during the villain phase, so that's going to be an easy way to be able to defeat some minions. Jocaste is really interesting with something like Powerful Punch, which has the defense trait, she can potentially hold a card which will let you defeat a minion, which will eliminate a lot of the randomness of bringing these elements together. But Jocasta is a free cost ally who might end up sitting around until you have a minion in that you want to defeat with Change of Fortune. Because remember, despite all this, Change of Fortune does not just start in play at the start of the game, it is just a normal upgrade. So you can build your deck toward doing this, but until you have Change of Fortune in play, you're not getting that special benefit of this kind of more difficult, slightly unreliable game plan. So a little bit tricky on that front in terms of defeating the minions, but there are obviously a lot of cards here that I've talked about that can help with it. So there is a basis here, and we're going to have to see what we can work with. Then we have a ways to keep the minions around to make everything else we've just talked about a little bit more consistent. Tyrion and Iceman are allies that can stun. Daredevil, Victor Mancha, and Groot kind of can, take less damage from attacks, so, kind of heal from it a little bit. So they're all kind of interesting ways to help keep those minions around. These allies, I think, are very interesting. But then we have Pinned Down, and I think Pinned Down will be fantastic with Change of Fortune. Zero cost upgrade that you attach to a minion, that minion gets -2 attack. Most minions in the game are now doing 0 damage, and a couple of them are maybe doing 1 damage. Some exceptions, particularly with Villainous, maybe doing a bit more, but for the most part, Pinned Down is neutralizing most minions' attack. So that's really, really good. But do we want to use Pin Down and then something like Powerful Punch? Are we going to spend basically a card from our hand to neutralize the minion, then play an inefficient card to take out the minion, and then finally we get our card draw? We would be much better off not doing that in the first place. Just playing a regular, well-costed attack event, or playing some allies that can deal damage, defeating that minion normally. So what I think Pin Down will shine with are heroes and builds that have kind of things like Retaliate, passive ways that are going to basically defeat the minion. So you can throw Pin Down on the minion and let them just break themselves against your Retaliate. And hey, at some point, you're going to draw 2 cards for your troubles from Change of Fortune. I think that's actually pretty nice. We also have the new player side scheme, which I feel like I have to mention. I don't really like it for this purpose, but yeah, it can stun each enemy in play as well. We'll talk about this more in detail a little bit later in the video. I do like this side scheme in some situations, but maybe not too much for this build, nothing to rely on. So where does this leave us? Well, Under Control, yeah, not my favorite card so far. Change of Fortune, a lot of the cards that work with it, they're going to take some extra effort. But there is kind of a good end in sight, maybe a redemption kind of factor that we haven't really talked about, though I did allude to slightly. And that are heroes, heroes with their hero cards that are already good at this kind of thing. And this is where Change of Fortune is really going to shine, and maybe where it was always meant to shine. So aspect support, maybe not quite there fully to, allow this to flourish on its own, but let's look at the heroes. The first heroes I want to talk about are the Psionic heroes. Now, Phoenix and Psylocke both have access to Psychic Misdirection. This is an event I haven't talked about yet, and you can only play if you have the Psionic trait on your hero, so it's very, very limited right now. But when an enemy attacks you, you get to choose a different enemy, and damage from that attack is dealt to them instead. What this is used for most of the time is making the villain attack one of their own minions, basically. Phoenix actually gets Mind Control and an attack that kind of hits all minions, so if she's unleashed at least. So Phoenix actually can benefit from keeping minions around in the first place. So I've got a deck called Master of Puppets for Phoenix, which is about Pin Down, keeping them around to Psychic Misdirect already. So adding in a bit of card draw from Change of Fortune is going to be worth revisiting. Yeah, I'll probably do a new version of that deck. I'm really looking forward to that. Psylocke doesn't have quite as much to work with Phoenix, and she likes to flip a lot more than Phoenix. Phoenix does like to flip a lot, though, because Cerebro is so powerful. But Psylocke kind of gets a bigger hand size as well, so not as good for Psylocke, but I thought these were really interesting to talk about. We also have Karma as well, who is a Psionic traded ally who can grab control of minions, so keeping minions around until you get Karma is really fun as well. Then we have what I'm calling the Delayers. Vision with his intangible form can keep minions around attacking him, and they won't really deal much damage. That's pretty interesting. Iceman has his Frostbites to lower the damage of minions. Not quite so reliable, but interesting. Storm, however, has her Blizzard Weather, which makes all minions, or all enemies, deal -1 damage. So she can kind of keep minions around more easily that way, and she can actually use it special to blank their text boxes. So she can actually get around those pesky patrol minions and things, which might be a problem otherwise to keep around. She also has the Hurricane Weather, which can give her Retaliate. She also has the Flash Freeze event, which can help defend against multiple enemies. You hit it on the villain and any minions engaged with you, you're not taking damage from them, or you're taking a -3 damage from them. We then have Retaliators, people with that Retaliate stat kind of baked in from turn 1. Rogue has to put touched on the villain, Captain America has to play the shield, but all of these characters are getting retaliate pretty easily, pretty consistently, and that makes them interesting for this. Black Panther actually has healing from Vibranium Suit, and Energy Dagger can help cleave down any minions he's kept out against him or, received in. So he's going to be pretty good as well here, I think. I'm looking forward to trying that. Then we have what I'm calling the Eventfuls. These are characters with defense events which also deal damage to what they defended against. So they can use those events to deal damage to minions, and they're not going to have to exhaust to defend against them or anything. This is going to be quite nice. Nightcrawler can do this. He obviously comes with the new cards, so he's involved here. Magic, Nova, they all have these cards which prevent free damage and maybe deal free damage. Gamora has cross counter, and she might actually be more incentivized to use powerful punch here. It's just a tiny bit not quite worth it most of the time, in my opinion, for her at the moment. I think Change of Fortune could be just a little thing she needs to make that really, really viable, because she has those responses. When you play an attack, you get to remove a threat. So you're now playing Powerful Punch, you're getting to remove that threat with Finesse, and you might just get to draw 2 cards as well now. So I do like that for these characters, and some better than others. I don't think this will be that good for Nova, but Gamora and probably Nightcrawler, I think, are characters that I think will really enjoy this. Then we have what I'm calling the attackers, which is not strictly accurate as to what I'm implying here, but these are just characters with other ways that can kind of damage minions and things on the villain phase that they already have. Ghost Spider has 5 events which can do this. She has 3 copies of Ghost Kick, 2 copies of Web Binding, I think it's called. These can all deal good damage to minions and take them out in the villain phase really, really nicely. That's going to be very consistent, and I think Ghost Spider will be one of the best users of this. Gambit has his staff and armor, which if you're using a build that wants to stay more in hero form, he's going to be very, consistent at blocking minion damage and getting to at least ping a bit of damage with his staff, which will help those other methods we've looked at. But even more than that, he can play something like Powerful Punch, charge it up with his counters with his interrupt here, throw D card, and yeah, it's going to just help you smoothly take out minions no matter what health they have. So I think Gambit is a great candidate. Up next, we have Black Widow, who has the Widowmaker ability. She has Widow's Bite, the upgrade that she has, her preparation that deals damage when a minion enters play. So there's potential a weak minion will enter play, it will just immediately be defeated. So that's less of delayed slaying and kind of instant ambush. But we'll have to see how that works out, because yeah, it might be good against maybe something like the Temporal Modular set or the Enraged Symbiotes from the Symbiote Strength Modular set. But what about when those minions have like 6 or 7 health or toughness, that kind of thing? So yeah, we'll see how that works out. And she also has Synth Suit. Synth Suit lets you ready up after you trigger a preparation card. Also gives you +1 defense. So she might be able to defend the villain, trigger a preparation, maybe put some damage on the minion, and then she can defend against the minion, maybe trigger something like Under Control. Now, I don't know if Black Widow, who I think is quite a passive character, is going to want such a passive, kind of slow, slightly delayed archetype going on, but again, I think it's interesting. Then we have Shadowcat. Shadowcat doesn't have anything in her hero kit that really synergizes too well with this, in my opinion, except the fact she's incredibly good at defending, so you can use that to your advantage. But what Shadowcat likes to do in her protection decks already is actually take some of these cards that are maybe slightly more rare or not used so much, and actually get really good use because of the way her phased and solid form work. So Counter Punch already helps her change to the right form to defend again. Powerful Punch kind of does similar as well. It's an attack and defense in once. So she'll change from solid form to phased, to defend the attack, and then back to solid, and it's really good. These cards are pretty good on her already. So just adding Change of Fortune, and yeah, I've used Powerful Punch to take out a lot of minions on solo Shadowcat in protection, and drawing 2 cards to my troubles seems really, really good. So those are the heroes I'm mainly looking at. There's a few on my screen now that are kind of my favorites that I'm most looking forward to try sooner, but there's several others here that I'm really excited to try as well. So Change of Fortune with just aspect support on any old hero. I'm not saying it's not viable, but it might be on the lower end, in my opinion. But with the right hero, I actually think this has some potential, though I don't think it's going to be kind of, a rival for any of the most powerful builds in the game, put it that way. But it should be really fun. People like to do things on the villain phase, sometimes, and for people who like that, this is kind of the perfect kind of archetype to explore. Then we have the new player side scheme. I won't talk about this in great detail, but it's got 5 threat on it, it's 1 cost, and you can stun and confuse each enemy in play. In solo play, I don't think this is going to be a great card, but if you're against a multi-villain scenario, let's say the 4 Horsemen, this card suddenly becomes like basically the best card in the game. Basically against the 4 Horsemen, that'd be 8 activation blocks. Yeah, that's kind of good. That's kind of worth the trouble. So Very interesting card. It has this response where if you defend against it and take no damage, you get to remove a threat from the scheme. It's interesting. It's really such a strange player side scheme because it doesn't scale with the amount of players. And what's weirder is that it's called Astonishing X-Men, but non-X-Men can use this. And you can just run this on Captain America. You won't be able to use the response that revolves around X-Men characters, but you could just fort it normally. And somehow Captain America has Astonishing X-Men, the villain. I don't know how that works. Does he like show a poster of these, crazy X-Men, and now the villain's stunned and confused? I don't really get the thematic entirely here. I think this maybe should have been locked to the X-Men if they were going to name it this. A little bit strange, but as an actual mechanic or card, yeah, multi-villain scenarios. This is a tech card against them that will do very well. Then we can talk about the allies. This is my favorite bit of the new cards previewed in Nightcrawler, and I am so excited. I actually really love both of these cards. Initially, I was more excited about Rogue. I think I still am, but Gambit's become very close, and he's really my kind of ally. So let's talk about Gambit first. The Gambit is a free cost basic ally, and he's a bit of a gamble, which I think suits him very well in terms of his character and particularly the name. And he also really closely reflects the kind of the hero card, or should I say Rodrigo card, that he is based on from the hero identity, the playable Gambit. So Gambit has X forwarding and X attack. What does that mean? Well, X is the number of boost icons on the card under Gambit. So how does he get those? Here's a response, which when he enters play, he gets to look at the top 3 cards of the encounter deck, and he gets to basically keep one for himself, and that's where the boost icons come from. So if you get lucky, he could have free forwarding and free attack, because he might have a card with 3 boost icons on tucked underneath him. If you manage to find one as one of the top 3 cards of the encounter deck, that's really good. But there are other uses here as well, because he has to look at the top 3 cards of the encounter deck. You can kind of see what's coming up next. You might choose to give him maybe not the best stats, but a card that moves things around to make sure your encounter card in the upcoming villain phase isn't as bad. Or alternatively, you might choose an encounter card that you don't want to come up again, and you can trap it. Gambit stolen it away, and the villain can't have it. So there's some really cool uses here. We can give him big stats. We can set up our next, villain phase, and we can just lock away a card for as long as Gambit is on the board. That has really interesting implications. The whole thing of looking at the top of the encounter deck is very much like, Remy's, Gambit's alter ego ability, Thief Extraordinaire. I really love the thematics, and I love the multiple uses. It's a very layered card, and I think it will have some very niche, very kind of uses that when you figure them out in the moment, you will feel like a genius for doing so. Something that springs to mind is there are cards that when the villain changes, to a different, villain stage, they have a bone revealed that finds a specific card. Well, let's say Gambit has been played and you're fighting Thanos, and you happen to find Thanos' armor. Gambit basically steals the armor. When Thanos enters stage 3, if you're playing him on expert, he will look for that armor, but guess what? Gambit's got it, so he can't find it because Thanos only searches the deck and discard pile. That kind of thing is incredibly fun, and I just love the image of Thanos looking about, trying to find his armor, and Gambit's, just sneaking off in the background, carrying it away. I think that's really good, and I think that's really fun. And the bonus of this specific example is that Thanos' armor has 3 boost icons on it. So now Gambit can do free forwarding or free attack, which you might want to heal him up, maybe use some game times on him. I don't know. I think this could be pretty good. Now, there are some downsides here. I mean, if you're bringing Gambit just for this purpose, the chance that one of the top 3 encounter cards will be this kind of card is pretty low. But it's a nice bonus when it happens, and it will happen, particularly if you're playing him, a couple of times throughout a game. So, yeah, give me some fun strategies there with Gambit. Now, Gambit does synergize with some player cards as well. We have Global Logistics and Cosmo, which all care about the top cards of the encounter deck. What is a bit more fun and worth talking about, I think, is the Havoc ally. Havoc is an X-Men ally, so is Gambit, so you might see them both in Uncanny X-Men decks. And his Forced Interrupt makes him discard the top card of the encounter deck, and he gets to deal extra damage for each boost icon, but also take extra damage for each boost icon, which can be pretty perilous for him, shall we say that. You might get one massive attack, but sometimes he just knocks himself out. So Uncanny X-Men does make this less likely to happen in one go, but Gambit being able to scout out the deck does make using Havoc a lot easier. You can kind of take this onto Wiccan. You can maybe make sure Wiccan's getting some good damage when you're using him. And Spider-Ham, maybe if you're running a Gambit / Spider, deck, which is a little bit strange. So I think Havoc in leadership builds is maybe more commonly going to interact. But nonetheless, very, very interesting that he can do that on top of just getting, potentially good stats and potentially locking bad cards away. What if he finds Under Fire from the expert set? The deck resets, and hey, guess what? You're completely safe from Under Fire. That is a huge benefit, especially in 4-player, where you'll move through the encounter deck fast and maybe, go for it a couple times in any given game. So really, really fun uses. And I guess I should mention there are even a few encounter cards in the game with 4 boost icons on them. So Gambit can potentially be an absolute monster, but this is going to be very rare and depend on the scenario and mod sets a lot. Then we have Rogue. I'm so excited for this ally. It's a 4-cost ally, 2 2 attack, 3 health. Action, deal 1 damage to a friendly character. Already kind of weird, but interesting. Until the end of the round, Rogue gains each of that character's traits and adds that character's printed fort and attack to her matching powers. So she picks a friendly character, she deals 1 damage to them, and suddenly she is powered up and changed, not changed her traits, but gained traits. This has so many possibilities, both on the trait level, but also on the fort and attack boosting level. But even dealing 1 damage to another friendly character is really good. Spider-Ham, for instance, is going to be able to generate himself a toon counter here, which is really, really fun. I'm sure there's a couple other uses for this, but I just want to talk on more sort of general uses here. And I do also want to shout out that this is really fun, kind of an interpretation of Rogue's powers. Now, I actually like that Rogue's action on, the ally version deals damage to a friendly character. Because if you've read the comics, if you've watched the movies, when Rogue touches someone, it doesn't generally do them any good. It hurts them quite badly, sometimes puts them into comas, things like that. So the fact that the Rogue hero, when you use touch on a friendly character, doesn't do anything negative at all, unless you pull the obligation, which is, fairly rare, but, it does happen. But just the 1 damage when you're doing it makes it feel a lot more like Rogue's power, in my opinion. So in some ways, I think this ally is more thematic than the hero, at least on the, just the identity card slash touched. So what can we do with the mechanics? Well, what happens if Rogue touches Phoenix, the hero? Well, suddenly Rogue has 5 forwarding. Yes, Phoenix has taken 1 damage from the action here, but Rogue has 5 fort. That's insane. That's crazy. That's incredibly good. If Rogue does that 3 turns in a row and, forts 3 times afterwards, that's 15 threat removed. If you manage to ready her up or heal her, this can go even crazier. This is absolutely phenomenal, and Phoenix is actually one of the characters that will be able to afford Rogue and start to get some X-Men synergy going as well. So I think Phoenix and Rogue, it's going to be hard to play Phoenix in protection without Rogue, at least in multiplayer. In solo play, 5 extra threat removal might be a little bit much here. And we do have to note here that it is printed stats only. So if Phoenix goes unleashed and technically kind of has 3 basic attack, it's not printed on her card. Rogue cannot borrow that. The only other character to get free forwarding is Ironheart in her final version. So that is an option. And I think if Ironheart's on the table, it might be that somebody else in multiplayer has brought Rogue, but Ironheart could potentially bring Rogue herself. It is kind of interesting. And borrowing 2 attack is pretty decent as well if that's what you need. There are also plenty of heroes with 3 attacks, so I haven't really featured them here, but there are quite a lot of those, such as Ant-Man, hey, maybe Hulk, you could do various things with that. So that's pretty interesting, but Rogue touching allies is another avenue that I think is worth exploring. One of the obvious ones is going to be Professor X, because again, free forwarding, guess what? Now Rogue has 5 forwarding herself again. That is ridiculous, but the other great advantage of Professor X is he has a health points that you don't use. You basically play Professor X, fought with him, then block with him. So you ever use that free health up. You always have, one that you haven't, cared about. You can use Rogue to just damage him and it doesn't really matter. That's amazing. Nick Fury's kind of in a similar position. His forwarding stat isn't as impressive, but he does have a good spread of attack and forwarding, and he doesn't care about that second hit point. So again, I think Rogue in decks with Professor X and Nick Fury will be a nice little combo. Then we have Rockslide and Colossus, who are allies with free attack and plenty of health. Lastly, I want to talk about Triage in terms of the X-Men allies here. Triage can heal 2 damage from Rogue. That's really good. She could technically also maybe heal whoever Rogue used, her action on to damage them. But for the most part, I think keeping Rogue around is going to be really good. She's very expensive. She's a big investment, but then she can have really big stats. Now, dealing damage to you is a downside, but I think the upside of her stats definitely outweighs it. I think healing Rogue is going to be very valuable. I think she's going to be pretty decent just played as she is, especially with the right characters on the board. But if you can keep her alive, you can potentially play her very early on and just get massive stats turn after turn after turn. Well, that's where Med Team comes in. That's going to combo really well with Rogue. Again, it's expensive. This might be something Phoenix is looking at, maybe something Bishop is looking at, maybe something Magic is looking at, but it is really, really good. Then you've got Protective Training, which is a 1-cost card you can attach to an X-Men. That gives them 3 more health. That gives Rogue 3 extra uses, but more than that, it enables game time, so Rogue can start to go crazy and, maybe remove 10 threat in a turn. Maybe, deal 10 damage. It's very, very good. The more times you can ready Rogue to use her boosted stats, you know, it's better to boost her stats once and deal 1 damage to a friendly character and then get lots of use out of those stats rather than, have to keep damaging someone and use her over time. So if any of your other players are maybe running some like Command Team or Get Ready, Get Ragey, Sidekick Kicker, those are all going to be great targets to, Rogue will be a great target for those cards. Now, we've talked about the X-Men trait working with Rogue in terms of like triage, protective training, and so on. But what about the Rogue ally's ability to take another character's traits as well? What can we do with that? Well, not a lot else in protection, but in basic, there are a few kind of interesting options. We have Web of Life and Destiny. We can make Rogue a Web Warrior. So if you're running a Web Warrior hero, or maybe even just a Web Warrior deck, you can actually basically use Rogue as an extra Web Warrior, which I think is really, really fun. Rogue is basically going to go in every protection Spider-Ham deck, and maybe some other Web Warrior decks. I think that could be really interesting. Now, again, I think there's so much value in keeping Rogue in play. If you draw a card when she leaves play, hey, don't complain about that. I think that's really, really good. Then we have the Posse, which I think is going to be very, very niche. Obviously, it's just for Domino here with the Rogue ally, but since Rogue can become a Posse ally, then you suddenly have this card online a lot easier. This lets you heal damage from each of those characters with that trait and ready them. So I can see Domino in Protection actually running the Rogue ally. I'm not going to say it all the time, but if you want to try and lean into this, I think that could be really fun. Lastly, we've got to go for Champions, which is one of the, the Champions event that basically makes all champions on the board immortal. So this is going to be a bit more niche to make, get a lot more worth from Rogue, but it is interesting that it can happen. In multiplayer specifically, you can take things from the other aspects. Other players can give you those. Or you could be playing Spider-Woman as well, I suppose. But people are going to be able to maybe, if you have Rogue use that action on a Guardian character, another player can then put Energy Spear on her for, massive attack stat, Combs Implant for a very, very valuable health boost and plus forwarding. And hey, maybe if she touches an Avenger, she can get a little bonus from Avengers Assemble. Little things like that are really, really interesting. So I'm super excited to try Rogue. I wonder if there are some more combos. I bet in the future of the game, as we get more traits and more things that work with traits, we'll get even more fancy stuff. Maybe we'll get other characters with big stats that'll become really interesting, or allies with disposable hit points. There's a lot to love about the Rogue ally that will come about and, manifest even in the future as well as in the present. And that about does it. This is kind of the end of the video here. Let me know what you think of these new cards. How excited are you for Change of Fortune? Do you think it's going to be a bit tricky to work, kind of like I do? Or do you think it's going to be, very easy to use and I've overestimated the difficulty? And yeah, if you could like, comment, subscribe, anything that makes YouTube happy really, really helps the channel. Marvel Champions is a very niche area. If you want to support the channel, I have opened a Patreon and also YouTube memberships, but it really helps the channel. I'm trying to put it back into the channel. If you watched my channel update recently, you might know about that. Thanks to all the amazing, amazing support from the patrons and YouTube members, I actually have new lighting. So I'm recording this, quite late in the evening, kind of into the night here. And normally in my videos, you can look at my magic video for an example. I look terrible. It's just, very dark, very gloomy. The camera can barely keep up. It's out of focus because it's so dark. I basically have better lighting here now at this time than I do in the daytime, earlier when I record. I've got 2 lights, one to my left, one to my right here, and it's incredibly useful. I think it looks a lot better. Hopefully you guys do as well. So if you want to support that, I think the next thing we're looking for is maybe better cameras. That would really, really help as well. Particularly since I only have one good camera. If I had a second one, we can maybe have a lot more convenient gameplay, because right now I would have to dismantle this setup to record anything else anywhere else. So yeah, that's kind of what we're looking at, but I don't expect anything. Just a simple like on the video, and I am eternally grateful. If you share the video, you're an absolute legend. That's really good. And last but not least, we actually have over 100 members on our Discord server for the channel, and links for all this will be down in the description. If you want to join in with anything, please go ahead, and if not, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day, and I'll catch you in the next video.